The cold of the polished linoleum floor seeped through the thin denim of her jeans, a chilling reality check in an aisle overflowing with manufactured joy. Eleanor Vance pulled her son, Leo, closer, his small body trembling with silent sobs that felt like tiny earthquakes against her chest. Tears tracked clean paths through the grime on his cheeks, mirroring the ones burning her own. His fingers, small and desperate, were clamped around a large cardboard box, as if letting go would mean letting go of the last piece of magic left in the world. Inside the box, a 2-foot-tall hero of red and blue plastic, Optimus Prime, stood stoic and powerful, a silent sentinel to a 7-year-old's shattered heart. The store's speakers chirped a painfully cheerful rendition of Jingle Bells, a soundtrack to her complete and utter failure as a mother. Every glittering garland, every smiling Santa display felt like a personal accusation. She could feel the stares of other shoppers, their carts piled high with gifts, their casual prosperity a world away from her reality. Shame was a physical thing, a hot, heavy blanket threatening to suffocate her. She squeezed her eyes shut, wanting to disappear, to rewind time, to have never made the foolish promise of just looking at the toys. Then, through the fog of her own misery and the store's festive noise, a small, clear voice cut through. It wasn't meant for her, but it landed like a stone in the pit of her stomach. A few feet away, a little blond boy with a solemn face turned to his impeccably dressed father, his small hands clasped together as if in prayer. He pointed a tentative finger toward them. "Dad," the boy whispered, his voice filled with a profound, unchildlike empathy. "She can't buy a Christmas gift for her son." The words hung in the air, a simple, brutal truth that stripped away all pretense. It was an observation, not a judgment, but for Eleanor, it was the final, devastating blow. That feeling, the one where the entire world seems to be watching you at your lowest moment. If you've ever felt that lump in your throat, that burning behind your eyes, take a moment to hit that like button. It tells us that these stories of quiet struggle and unexpected connection are the ones that truly need to be told. But to understand the crushing weight of that little boy's words, to feel the chasm that separated Eleanor's $37 from that $89 price tag, we have to go back. Not far. Just to the bitter, biting chill of that same Chicago morning, long before the fluorescent lights of Wallace's department store had illuminated their despair. The day had begun, as it always did, in darkness. At 4:30 in the morning, the wind howled outside their small apartment in Pilsen, a mournful sound that rattled the single-pane window in Eleanor's bedroom. The radiator in the corner had given up the ghost 3 days ago, and now a deep, penetrating cold had settled into the very bones of the building. She slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb Leo, who was a small lump under a mound of every blanket they owned. She could see her breath in the air as she pulled on her worn-out work uniform, the faded polo shirt and black pants of the morning grind coffee shop. There was no time for a shower. The hot water was a luxury she rationed for Leo. Instead, she splashed icy water on her face from the rusted bathroom faucet, the shock of it a necessary jolt to wake her sleep-deprived body. Downstairs, the coffee shop was a blur of motion and demanding customers. She forced a smile, her voice a practiced, cheerful mask as she took orders, frothed milk and wiped down sticky counters. "Have a great day," she'd chirp, handing over $5 lattes to people who would spend more on coffee in a week than she had for groceries in a month. Each clink of change in her tip jar was a tiny victory, a small step away from the edge of financial ruin. But the tips were meager that day. The holiday season seemed to make people more stressed, less generous. By the time her shift ended at 11, her feet ached and the smile on her face felt like it had been chiseled from stone. She had made exactly $9.25 in tips. She didn't go straight home. Her second job didn't start until 10 at night. The hours in between were a carefully managed tightrope walk of errands and precious time with Leo. After picking him up from school, a place where he was often teased for his hand-me-down coat, they walked home, their path taking them past storefronts decorated with elaborate Christmas displays. Leo's face, usually so serious, would light up at the sight of the twinkling lights and festive scenes. He never asked for anything, a habit of restraint that broke his mother's heart. He had learned too early that asking led to disappointment. He understood their poverty in a way no 7-year-old should. He knew that the fancy toys in the windows were for other kids from a different world. That afternoon, as they huddled in their cold apartment sharing a bowl of soup for lunch, Leo had been unusually quiet. He was sketching on a piece of scrap paper with a stubby pencil, his brow furrowed in concentration. Eleanor looked over his shoulder and saw it. A detailed, surprisingly accurate drawing of Optimus Prime. "He's the leader," Leo had said, not looking up from his work. "He protects everyone. He makes sure everyone is safe." The words were a punch to the gut. Eleanor knew he wasn't just talking about a cartoon robot. He was talking about the world outside their door. The loud arguments from the apartment next door, the sirens that wailed through the night, the constant unspoken fear of losing the little they had. In his mind, Optimus Prime was the father he never knew, the protector she was struggling so desperately to be. It was then that she made the fateful decision. "Hey, buddy," she said, her voice brighter than she felt. "How about we go downtown, just to look at the big Christmas tree at Daly Plaza and see the window displays at Wallace's? We won't buy anything, just look. It'll be our little adventure." Leo's eyes had widened, a spark of genuine excitement replacing his usual somberness. An adventure, a chance to feel normal, to participate in the magic of Christmas, even if only as a spectator. It seemed like such a small, harmless thing, a free gift of holiday cheer. Miles away, in a sprawling penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, another father and son were starting their day in a silence as cold as Eleanor's apartment. Arthur Sterling stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling window, a cup of black coffee untouched in his hand. The city skyline, a landscape he had helped shape with his real estate empire, spread out before him, but he saw none of it. All he saw was the reflection of a man in a perfectly tailored suit who felt like a ghost in his own life. Since his wife Catherine had died 2 years ago, the world had lost its color. He moved through his days with mechanical precision, board meetings, acquisitions, charity galas, but he wasn't truly living in them. His heart had been buried with her. His 5-year-old son, Noah, was the living embodiment of his failure. Noah had been a bright, bubbly child when Catherine was alive. Now, he was a quiet, watchful little boy who rarely smiled. Arthur gave him everything money could buy, the best tutors, closets full of designer clothes, toys that sat untouched in their boxes. He provided everything except the one thing Noah needed, a father who was truly present. The holidays were the worst. They were a raw, gaping wound, a reminder of the laughter and warmth that once filled these sterile, museum-like rooms. He had promised Noah they would go pick out a new ornament for the tree, a tradition Catherine had cherished. It was an act of forced festivity, a painful pantomime of a happy family. When he told Noah where they were going, the boy had simply nodded, his expression unchanging. He didn't ask for any toys. He never did. He just wanted his father. Their arrival at Wallace's department store was a study in contrasts. For Eleanor and Leo, stepping inside was like entering a different dimension. The blast of warm air, the scent of cinnamon and pine, the symphony of carols and chatter. It was overwhelming, a sensory assault of everything they didn't have. Leo's hand tightened in hers, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and trepidation. For Arthur and Noah, the store was just another place. Arthur moved through the crowds with an air of detached authority, his personal assistant, David, trailing a few steps behind. Noah walked beside him, his small hand lost in his father's, his gaze sweeping over the chaotic displays without interest. Fate, or perhaps the simple chaotic currents of a crowded department store, guided both families down the same path. Aisle 7, the action figure aisle. For Arthur, it was just a row of plastic and cardboard, but for Leo, it was a cathedral. And there, on a middle shelf, illuminated as if by a heavenly spotlight, was the object of all his 7-year-old dreams, the 2-foot-tall Optimus Prime. He let go of his mother's hand and drifted toward it, as if pulled by an invisible string. Eleanor followed, a sense of dread beginning to curdle in her stomach. She saw the look on his face, the pure, unadulterated longing. He didn't touch the box at first. He just stood before it, reverent. "Mom," he breathed, his voice a whisper. "It's him." She knelt beside him, her heart already beginning to ache. She saw the price tag tucked into the corner of the shelf, $89.99. It might as well have been $1 million. The $37.50 in her wallet, money that had to last them until a paycheck that was already spent on their overdue rent, felt like a handful of dust. This was the moment she had to break his heart. "Leo, honey, it's beautiful," she started, her voice already cracking under the strain. She gently touched his shoulder, trying to pull him away from the impossible dream. But we can't. Not this one. The boy's words were not loud, but in the sterile, sound-dampened world Arthur Sterling had inhabited for the past 2 years, they were a thunderclap. "Dad, she can't buy a Christmas gift for her son." He looked from his own son's earnest, concerned face to the woman across the aisle, who was now pulling her weeping child into a fierce, protective hug. Arthur saw the tremor in her shoulders, the way she buried her face in the boy's thin coat, and he felt a phantom ache in his own chest, a hollow echo of a pain he knew all too well. It was the pain of helplessness, of wanting to shield a child from a world that was too harsh, too cold, too full of things that money couldn't fix. But in her case, money was the very thing she lacked. He saw his late wife, Catherine, in that embrace. Catherine, who believed that love was an action, a shield, a warm home on a cold night. She would have seen this woman's quiet dignity and her son's silent sorrow, and she would have done something. Not with a grand public display, but with the quiet, effective grace that had defined her. For 2 years Arthur had been numb, a passenger in his own life, but Noah's simple, empathetic observation had just handed him the steering wheel. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt since Catherine's diagnosis. Purpose. He squeezed Noah's hand gently and leaned down. "You're right, son," he murmured, his voice thick with an unfamiliar emotion. "We should do something about that." He straightened up, his gaze sweeping the aisle. He caught the eye of his assistant, David Chen, who was hovering discreetly near a display of board games. David's expression was, as always, neutral, but he met Arthur's gaze with the practiced readiness of a man who could anticipate needs before they were spoken. Arthur gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod in the direction of Eleanor and Leo. He led Noah a few steps away, creating a screen of privacy with his own body. "David," he said in a low voice, turning his back to the scene, "the mother and son in aisle 7. I need you to find out who they are. Name, address, anything you can. Be discreet. I don't want them to know they were even noticed." "Of course, Mr. Sterling," David replied, his eyes already cataloguing details. The woman's worn coat, the boy's scuffed shoes, the fierce set of her jaw. "Is there anything else?" Arthur hesitated, his eyes finding the Optimus Prime box that Leo had been forced to abandon on the shelf. The gleaming plastic hero seemed to mock the scene with its promise of strength and protection. "Yes," Arthur said, a new resolve hardening his voice. "Buy 2 of those robots. Have one gift-wrapped and sent to my office. The other, hold on to it for now." With that, he took Noah's hand again. "Come on, buddy. Let's go find that ornament." He walked away without a backward glance, not out of coldness, but because looking again would feel like an intrusion. He had seen enough. The image of the mother's desperate love and the son's quiet heartbreak was seared into his mind. It was no longer just a stranger's misfortune. It had become his responsibility. Eleanor finally managed to coax Leo's fingers from the shelf. He didn't fight her. He simply went limp, his small body heavy with a resignation that was far more painful than any tantrum. She scooped him up, his 7 years feeling like 100 pounds of dead weight, and walked quickly, almost running from the toy aisle. She didn't stop until they were out of the store, back on the frigid Chicago street where the December wind bit at their exposed skin. The cheerful music and warm air of the store were gone, replaced by the wail of a distant siren and the indifferent bustle of the city. Leo was silent the entire bus ride home. He just stared out the window, his reflection a ghostly image superimposed over the blur of passing buildings. Eleanor's heart felt like it was cracking into 1,000 tiny pieces. She wanted to scream, to rage at the unfairness of it all. What kind of world was it, where a mother's love wasn't enough? Where her working 2 jobs, cleaning up after people until her bones ached, still left her unable to afford a simple piece of plastic that would bring her son a moment of joy. Back in their apartment, the cold was waiting for them like an unwelcome relative who had overstayed his welcome. Eleanor wrapped Leo in the thickest blanket and sat him on the sofa, then set about making them dinner. Grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup from a can. It was their comfort meal, but tonight it offered no comfort. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against bowls and the relentless rattling of the window pane. After dinner, she read to him from a tattered library book, her voice soft and steady as she tried to weave a cocoon of normalcy around them. But she could feel the distance in him. His mind was still in aisle 7, staring at a hero he couldn't have. After she tucked him into bed, kissing his tear-stained cheek. Eleanor sat at their small, wobbly kitchen table under the light of a single bare bulb. She pulled out a shoebox filled with bills. There it was, tucked between an overdue electricity bill and a final notice from the gas company. A stark white envelope with a red border. An official eviction notice. She had been served it last week. A formal declaration that their time in this cold, drafty apartment was up. They had until the end of the month. 2 weeks. Her next paycheck, the one she'd get the day after Christmas, was already gone, allocated to a landlord who had no holiday spirit. She had been praying for a miracle, for extra shifts, for a sudden windfall of tips. But there was no miracle coming. There was only this cold room and this terrifying piece of paper. If you've ever found yourself sitting at a kitchen table late at night, staring at a stack of bills that feels like an impossible mountain, let us know in the comments. That feeling of being backed into a corner is something too many people face in silence, and sharing these stories is the first step to finding a way through. Eleanor dropped her head into her hands, and for the first time that day, she allowed her own tears to fall. They were hot, bitter tears of rage, fear, and profound loneliness. She wasn't just failing to buy a Christmas present, she was failing to keep a roof over her son's head. She was failing at everything. Meanwhile, in a quiet office 20 floors above the city, David Chen was working with silent efficiency. Getting Eleanor's name had been the easy part. A quick, discreet inquiry with the store's security chief, framed as a follow-up on a potential loyalty program candidate, had yielded a name from her credit card transaction for a small coffee she had bought earlier. Eleanor Vance. From there, the digital breadcrumbs were easy for someone with his resources to follow. Public records, social media footprints, employment verification databases. Within 2 hours, he had a complete picture, and it was bleaker than Arthur had imagined. He compiled the information into a concise, bullet-pointed report. Eleanor Vance, age 29. No living relatives in the state. 2 part-time minimum-wage jobs. Landlord, a notoriously ruthless property management company. Current address, an apartment in Pilsen with numerous code violations. And the final damning detail, an eviction notice filed with the county court a week prior. David printed the report and placed it in a sleek leather folder. He then made one more call, to a contact in the city's most prestigious real estate law firm. When Arthur returned to his penthouse, the silence was absolute. Noah was already in bed, asleep in a room filled with more toys than he could ever play with. Arthur walked through the cavernous living room, his footsteps echoing on the marble floors. He stopped in front of the fireplace, where a single framed photograph sat on the mantel. It was of Catherine, taken on a beach in a summer that felt like a lifetime ago. She was laughing, her head thrown back, her eyes sparkling with a light that he feared he would never see again. She would have known what to do, he whispered to the photograph. He had started this with a simple intention, to answer his son's plea and buy a toy for a little boy. But now, holding the folder David had left for him, he saw how hopelessly inadequate that gesture was. Buying the toy would be a temporary balm on a gaping wound. It wouldn't fix the broken radiator. It wouldn't stop the eviction. It wouldn't give that fiercely protective mother a moment's peace. Catherine wouldn't have just put a bandage on the problem. She would have healed the injury. She would have invested in the person, not the problem. He opened the folder. As he read about Eleanor's 2 jobs, her lack of a support system, the eviction notice, his decision solidified. This was no longer just about his son's empathy, or even about honoring Catherine's memory. It was about justice. It was about rebalancing the scales, just a little. He picked up his phone and dialed David's number. "The report is comprehensive," Arthur said, his voice low and steady. "The robot isn't enough." "I suspected as much, sir," David replied. "There's a townhouse I acquired last month in a foreclosure auction," Arthur continued, his mind already working, the gears of his business acumen turning towards a new, more personal project. "Lincoln Park, on a quiet, tree-lined street. It's sitting empty." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "The 3-bedroom on Arlington Place?" David asked, his voice carefully neutral. "The one we were planning to flip in the spring." "That's the one," Arthur confirmed. He walked over to the window and looked down at the river of lights that was the city. Somewhere down there, in a cold apartment, a woman was terrified of losing her home. "I want you to call the legal team. Tell them to draw up the paperwork to transfer the deed. I'm giving her the house." Another pause, this one longer. "Sir, a gift of that magnitude." "It's not a gift, David. It's an investment," Arthur said, echoing the words he knew Catherine would have used. "In a mother who refuses to give up, and in a little boy who deserves a safe place to dream about heroes." He looked back at Catherine's picture, a faint smile touching his lips for the first time in what felt like an eternity. "Get it done. I want you at her door tomorrow morning. Christmas Eve. Bring the deed, bring the keys, and bring the other robot." He hung up the phone, the silence of the penthouse no longer feeling empty, but filled with a quiet, powerful sense of purpose. For the first time in 2 years, he felt like he was building something that truly mattered. He was building a home. Christmas Eve dawned not with a gentle fall of snow, but with a sky the color of slate and a wind that scraped against the windows like a hungry animal. Eleanor had barely slept, dozing fitfully at the kitchen table until the pre-dawn gloom began to filter into the room. Her body ached with a weariness that went deeper than muscle, a soul-deep exhaustion born of relentless worry. She felt hollowed out, a fragile shell of the woman she was supposed to be. Leo was still asleep, a small mercy. She didn't want him to see the despair in her eyes, the utter defeat that had settled over her in the dark hours of the night. She stared at the eviction notice, its red letters a stark reminder of their impending homelessness. She had spent hours trying to find a solution, a way out. She had called the landlord's office yesterday, pleading for an extension, a payment plan, anything. She was met with the cold bureaucratic indifference of a recorded message. She had searched online for emergency housing, but the shelters were all full, overflowing with families just like hers, swept away by the undertow of poverty in a city of glittering wealth. Hope was a foreign country she no longer had a passport for. She made a pot of coffee, the cheap, bitter kind, and drank it black, letting the harsh taste jolt her senses. The apartment was colder than ever, a damp chill that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. She looked around at their meager possessions, the threadbare sofa, the second-hand books on a makeshift shelf, Leo's drawings taped to the peeling paint of the refrigerator door. It wasn't much, but it was their home. The thought of packing it all into boxes, of telling Leo they had to leave the only home he'd ever known, was a physical pain. She wrapped her hands around the warm mug, trying to absorb some of its heat, when a sharp, authoritative knock echoed from the front door. Her heart leaped into her throat. It was too early for the landlord to come in person, but dread coiled in her stomach anyway. Maybe it was a city marshal, here to post a final warning. Her hands trembled as she set the mug down. Taking a deep breath, she walked to the door and peered through the peephole. A man she didn't recognize stood in the dim hallway. He was wearing a dark, expensive-looking overcoat and held a sleek leather briefcase. He didn't look like a marshal or anyone from the landlord's office. He looked corporate, professional. It was even more terrifying. Perhaps he was a debt collector for one of her medical bills from when Leo had pneumonia last winter. She opened the door a crack, keeping the chain lock engaged. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice raspy. The man offered a polite, disarming smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It was a professional smile, practiced and precise. "Eleanor Vance?" he asked. She nodded numbly, clutching the edge of the door. "My name is David Chen. I work for Mr. Arthur Sterling." The name was meaningless to her. She mentally scanned a list of all the companies she'd ever owed money to, every bill she'd ever been late on. The name Sterling wasn't on it. "I'm sorry, I don't know who that is," she said, her confusion mounting. "I believe you were at Wallace's department store yesterday," David said smoothly, his gaze unwavering. "In the toy department. My employer, Mr. Sterling, was also there with his son. He was moved by your situation." The words hit Eleanor like a slap. Humiliation, hot and immediate, washed over her. Her despair from yesterday was not a private moment after all. It had been a spectacle. Her poverty had been on display for a wealthy stranger to witness, and apparently pity. Her back stiffened, a surge of protective pride cutting through her fear. "Look, I appreciate the concern, but we don't need charity," she said, her voice sharp. She started to close the door. "This isn't charity, Ms. Vance," David said quickly, holding up a hand. His tone was calm, steady, and utterly serious. "Mr. Sterling considers it an investment." Eleanor paused, the word investment so out of place in this conversation that it stopped her cold. She slowly unhooked the chain and opened the door a little wider. "An investment in what?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. David's professional smile softened into something that looked almost genuine. He opened his briefcase and took out a simple, elegant box. From it, he produced a set of keys attached to a plain silver key ring. He held them out to her. "Mr. Sterling has recently acquired a property in Lincoln Park," he began, his voice taking on the cadence of a legal briefing. "A small, three-bedroom townhouse on Arlington Place. The deed was transferred and filed with the county clerk's office this morning. It was purchased in your name." Eleanor stared at the keys, then back at his face, certain she was either dreaming or losing her mind. The words made no sense. They were just a string of sounds that her brain refused to assemble into a coherent thought. "My name? Lincoln Park? What are you talking about?" she stammered. David's gaze was patient. "The house is yours, Miss Vance. It's fully furnished. Mr. Sterling has also arranged for the first year of property taxes and utilities to be paid in advance, to give you time to get settled." Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. She leaned against the doorframe for support, her mind reeling. This had to be a cruel joke, a scam of some kind. People like her didn't get given townhouses in Lincoln Park. People like her got eviction notices. "Why?" she whispered, the single word encompassing a universe of disbelief. "Why would a complete stranger do this?" "His son was very concerned," David said simply, and for the first time a flicker of real emotion crossed his face. "Noah, he's a very observant boy. He saw how much your son wanted that toy. He saw how much you wanted to give it to him." David then reached back into his briefcase and pulled out a thick file folder. "Mr. Sterling said to me, a boy should have a hero for Christmas, and his mother shouldn't have to worry about a roof over his head to give him one. He believes in investing in people with character, Miss Vance. He saw yours yesterday." He handed her the folder. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely take it. She fumbled with the clasp and opened it. Inside, printed on heavy, official-looking paper, was the deed to a house. Her name, Eleanor Marie Vance, was typed in bold letters. It was real. Behind the deed was a statement from a bank, detailing the establishment of an educational trust fund in the name of Leo Vance, and tucked behind that was a cashier's check, made out to her for $50,000. The memo line read, "For transitional expenses." She sank onto the nearest chair, the one with the wobbly leg by the door. The folder spread across her lap like a sacred text. The keys felt heavy and cold in her palm, a tangible anchor to this new, impossible reality. "Mom?" A small voice came from the doorway to the living room. Leo stood there, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, his hair a mess. He was clutching a small stuffed bear with one missing eye. He looked from his mother's tear-streaked face to the strange man in the expensive coat. "Is everything okay?" Before Eleanor could find her voice, David smiled at the little boy. He reached down and lifted a large, brightly wrapped box that had been sitting at his feet. A box Eleanor hadn't even noticed. He knelt down to Leo's level. "I believe this is for you," he said, his voice gentle. "From a friend of Santa's." Leo's eyes widened as he took the heavy gift. He tore at the paper with the frantic energy of a child, and then he froze. There inside the box was the hero from aisle 7. Optimus Prime, in all his red and blue glory, stared back at him. Leo looked up at his mother, his face a perfect picture of bewildered joy, a question in his eyes that she had no idea how to answer. Eleanor could only shake her head, fresh tears streaming down her face. But these were different tears. They were not the hot, bitter tears of the night before. These were tears of shock, of gratitude, of an overwhelming, incomprehensible relief that felt like being able to breathe again after being held underwater for years. The next few hours were a surreal blur. David explained everything with quiet, methodical patience. A moving company was on standby. A car was waiting downstairs to take them to their new home whenever they were ready. He answered her stammered questions with simple, direct answers, deflecting any deeper inquiries about Arthur Sterling with polite professionalism. Mr. Sterling preferred to remain private. He asked for nothing in return. This was a one-time, unconditional investment. As David finally prepared to leave, Eleanor found her voice. "Please," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Please tell Mr. Sterling." "Thank you isn't a big enough word." David simply nodded. "I will, Miss Vance. Merry Christmas." And then he was gone, leaving Eleanor and Leo in their cold, cramped apartment, with a set of keys to a new universe and a 2-foot-tall robot standing guard in the middle of their living room. The drive to Lincoln Park felt like a journey to another planet. They sat in the back of a black town car, the quiet hum of the engine a stark contrast to the rattling clatter of the city bus. Leo was silent, clutching his new Optimus Prime, his face pressed against the window as the landscape changed from the gritty, graffiti-covered walls of Pilsen to the stately, brick-faced townhouses and manicured lawns of one of Chicago's wealthiest neighborhoods. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. She was an imposter, a trespasser in this world of quiet privilege. Every passing dog walker in expensive athletic wear, every gleaming luxury car, seemed to amplify her own feelings of inadequacy. What was she doing here? How could she possibly belong? The car pulled up to a beautiful three-story brick townhouse with a glossy black door and large, clean windows. It was nestled on a street lined with mature trees, their bare branches creating intricate patterns against the grey sky. It was perfect. It was terrifying. The driver, a kind-faced man who introduced himself as George, helped them with their single, pathetic-looking suitcase and a few garbage bags filled with their most essential belongings. He unlocked the front door and pushed it open. "Welcome home, Miss Vance," he said, and then with a discreet nod he left them alone on the threshold of their new life. Eleanor took Leo's hand, and they stepped inside. The first thing that hit her was the warmth, a gentle, enveloping heat that seemed to thaw the chill that had been lodged in her bones for years. The house smelled of fresh paint and new carpets. The entryway opened into a spacious living room, furnished with a comfortable-looking sofa, a soft rug and a large television. Sunlight, thin but present, streamed through the windows. It was clean. It was quiet. It was safe. They walked from room to room in a stunned silence. The kitchen was filled with gleaming new appliances, the refrigerator stocked with food. Milk, eggs, juice, bread. Upstairs there were 2 bedrooms. One was clearly a master bedroom, with a large bed made up with crisp white linens and a pile of fluffy pillows. The other room was for Leo. It was painted a cheerful shade of blue. It had a small bed with a comforter covered in stars and planets, a desk, a bookshelf filled with new books, and in the corner, a toy chest. It was the kind of room she had dreamed of giving him, a dream she had long ago filed away as impossible. When Leo saw it, he finally spoke. Is this our house?" he asked, his voice a tiny, awestruck whisper. Eleanor knelt down and pulled him into a hug, burying her face in his hair, breathing in the scent of her son in this warm, safe, impossible place. "Yes, baby," she choked out, the words catching in her throat. "This is our home." And as she held him, she felt the crushing weight she had been carrying for so long finally, miraculously, begin to lift. The first few weeks in the townhouse passed in a dream-like haze for Eleanor. She would wake up each morning in the soft, quiet darkness of her new bedroom, and for a fleeting moment panic would seize her. She'd feel the phantom chill of the old apartment, hear the phantom rattle of the loose window pane, and her heart would pound with the familiar dread of another day of struggle. Then her bare feet would touch the plush, warm carpet instead of the icy linoleum. The gentle hum of the central heating would register in her ears, and she would remember. It was real. The house, the safety, the impossible second chance. It was all real. She spent those early days simply existing in the space, as if afraid that moving too quickly or making too much noise would break the spell. She'd watch Leo play in his new room, a room bigger than their entire old apartment, his quiet concentration absolute, as he created elaborate battle scenarios for Optimus Prime. The robot was more than a toy. He was a symbol, a plastic and metal totem of the miracle that had happened to them. For the first time, Leo's world was a place of limitless imagination, not of limits and lack. He was finally just a boy, unburdened by the weight of his mother's poverty. Eleanor explored the house like a cautious archaeologist, uncovering a lost city. She opened every cabinet in the kitchen, marveling at the matching sets of plates and glasses. She ran her hand over the smooth, cool granite of the countertops. She took long, hot showers, standing under the steady stream of water until her skin was pink, reveling in the simple luxury of a pleasure she had long denied herself. The $50,000 check sat on the kitchen counter for a full week before she worked up the courage to take it to the bank. Walking into the grand, marble-floored institution in her worn-out coat and scuffed boots, she felt like a fraud. She was sure an alarm would sound the moment she handed the check to the teller. But the woman behind the glass simply smiled, processed the transaction with quiet efficiency, and handed her a receipt with a balance that made her vision swim. She walked out of the bank in a daze, the numbers on that piece of paper representing a level of security she had never known. It was more than money. It was freedom. It was the freedom to quit her night job cleaning offices, the freedom to buy Leo new shoes that fit properly, the freedom to finally fix the cracked screen on her phone. It was the freedom to breathe. Yet amidst the overwhelming relief and gratitude, a new, more complex feeling began to take root, a profound and unsettling sense of obligation. An anonymous benefactor, a man named Arthur Sterling, had changed the entire trajectory of her life with a single stunning act of generosity. But who was he? Why had he done it? The ad hoc chalk explanation from his assistant, that he was investing in character, felt both deeply flattering and unnervingly vague. She found herself scanning the business section of the newspaper, searching for his name. It didn't take long to find him. Arthur Sterling wasn't just a wealthy man, he was a titan of Chicago real estate, his face occasionally appearing in glossy magazine articles about the city's most influential figures. The pictures showed a man with a severe, handsome face, piercing eyes, and a palpable air of melancholy. The articles spoke of his business acumen, his ruthless negotiation tactics, and, in more recent pieces, the tragic death of his wife 2 years prior. His son, Noah, was mentioned only in passing. The knowledge made the gift feel even heavier. This wasn't some whimsical act of an eccentric billionaire. It was a deliberate choice made by a grieving man, prompted by his quiet, empathetic son. She owed them a debt she could never repay. The house wasn't just a gift. It was a responsibility. She had to prove that his investment in her was a wise one. She enrolled in an online course to get her GED, studying late into the night after Leo was asleep. She started volunteering at Leo's new school, a well-funded public school just a few blocks from their house. She wanted to build a life, not just inhabit one that had been given to her. She wanted to become a woman worthy of this miracle. Miles away, in his penthouse office overlooking the city, Arthur Sterling was undergoing a transformation of his own. The act of giving Eleanor the house had unlocked something within him, a dormant part of his soul that had been frozen since Catherine's death. For the first time in 2 years, he felt a flicker of the man he used to be, the man who believed in building communities, not just skyscrapers. His interactions with Noah began to change. Before, their time together had been structured and formal, punctuated by long, uncomfortable silences. Now Arthur found himself looking for opportunities to connect. He started leaving work earlier, making sure he was home to have dinner with his son. He'd ask Noah about his day, and instead of just nodding along, he would actually listen, picturing the small dramas of the kindergarten classroom. One evening, about a month after Christmas, he found Noah sitting in his playroom, surrounded by an army of expensive, untouched toys. In his hands, however, was the Optimus Prime, the twin to the one he had insisted his father buy for Leo. He wasn't staging a battle. He was carefully polishing the robot's plastic armor with a soft cloth. "You really like that one, don't you?" Arthur said, leaning against the doorframe. Noah nodded without looking up. "He's a leader," he said, his voice soft. "He protects people." Arthur felt a familiar pang in his chest. He sat on the floor next to his son, an act that would have felt unnatural just a few weeks ago. "Do you ever wonder about that other little boy?" Arthur asked gently. "The one from the store?" Noah looked up, his solemn blue eyes meeting his father's. "Is he safe now?" he asked. The question was so simple, so direct, and it cut right to the heart of everything. It wasn't about the toy. It was never just about the toy. It was about safety. It was about the fundamental right of a child to feel secure in the world. "Yes, Noah," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "He's safe. His mom is taking good care of him. They have a new house, a warm place to live." A small, rare smile touched Noah's lips. He went back to polishing his robot. The matter settled in his mind. But for Arthur, it was far from settled. He had provided a house, a physical structure of safety. But he knew from the hollow ache in his own life that a house was not the same as a home. A home was built of connection, of shared laughter, of love. And those were things he and Noah had been desperately lacking. The next Saturday, on an impulse, he did something he hadn't done in years. He took Noah to the Lincoln Park Zoo. They didn't have a driver or an assistant with them. It was just the two of them. They ate hot dogs that were probably terrible for them and marveled at the monkeys. And for the first time, Arthur heard his son laugh, a real, unrestrained belly laugh, at the antics of a clumsy sea lion. The sound was like music, a melody he thought he had forgotten. He realized that in trying to provide a home for Eleanor and Leo, he had inadvertently started to rebuild his own. Eleanor, meanwhile, was fighting her own battles. While the financial pressure was gone, a new kind of pressure had taken its place. The mothers at Leo's new school were a world away from the tired, working-class women she had known in Pilsen. They were polished, confident, and effortlessly wealthy. They drove luxury SUVs, wore expensive yoga pants, and talked about ski vacations and summer homes. Eleanor, in her Target jeans and second-hand sweaters, felt like an alien. She tried to connect, to find common ground, but the chasm between their life experiences felt too wide to bridge. There was one woman in particular, a perfectly coiffed, perpetually smiling woman named Brenda, who seemed to be the queen bee of the school's parent association. Brenda had taken a particular interest in Eleanor, an interest that felt less like friendship and more like a scientific study. "It's just so wonderful that you've been able to move into this neighborhood," Brenda had said one afternoon at pickup, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness. "It must be such a change for you. Where did you say you moved from again?" "Pilsen," Eleanor had replied, her chin held high. Brenda's smile tightened just a fraction. "Oh, how diverse," she'd said, before turning to discuss the caterer for the upcoming school fundraiser. Eleanor retreated, the familiar sting of shame and otherness washing over her. She knew what they thought of her. She was a charity case, a project. Her very presence in their pristine neighborhood was an anomaly they couldn't quite compute. The $50,000 check had seemed like a fortune, but in this world it was pocket change. She saw the way they looked at her car, an old beat-up sedan, and the way their eyes flickered over her clothes. She knew they whispered about her when she walked away. The school's annual spring fundraiser was the ultimate test. It was a lavish gala held at a downtown hotel with ticket prices that made Eleanor's stomach clench. It was the social event of the year for the school community, and attendance was all but mandatory. Brenda had made a point of reminding her, cornering her in the hallway. "We're all counting on you to be there, Eleanor. It's for the children, after all." The unspoken message was clear. This is your chance to prove you belong. Eleanor agonized over it for days. She didn't have anything to wear. She didn't know how to navigate that kind of event. The thought of spending an entire evening making small talk with people who looked down on her was excruciating. But then she looked at Leo, who was thriving. He was making friends, his grades were excellent, and the constant low-level anxiety that had always shadowed his face was gone, replaced by a confident sparkle in his eye. This school, this neighborhood, this life, it was for him, and she would do anything to protect it. She would walk through fire for him. She could certainly survive one high society fundraiser. She used some of the money from Arthur Sterling to buy a simple, elegant black dress, the most expensive piece of clothing she had ever owned. She spent hours watching YouTube tutorials on how to do her hair and makeup. When she looked in the mirror on the night of the gala, a stranger looked back at her, a woman who looked poised, elegant, and almost powerful. The gala was even more intimidating than she had imagined. The ballroom was a sea of tuxedos and designer gowns. The air buzzed with the confident chatter of the city's elite. Eleanor stood near the entrance, clutching a small purse, feeling like a small boat cast adrift in a vast ocean. She saw Brenda across the room, holding court, laughing with a group of other impeccably dressed women. She took a deep, fortifying breath and started to make her way towards the silent auction tables, planning to keep to herself as much as possible. And then she saw him. He was standing near the bar talking to another man. He was older than in the magazine pictures, with flecks of grey at his temples, but he was unmistakable. Arthur Sterling. His back was to her, but she recognized the severe set of his shoulders, the expensive cut of his tuxedo. Her heart started to beat a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. He was here. Her mysterious benefactor, the architect of her new life, was in the same room. What should she do? Should she approach him? Thank him? Or would that be an intrusion, a violation of the quiet anonymity he seemed to prefer? She was frozen, caught in a paralysis of indecision, when he turned. His eyes, cool and distant, swept across the room, and for a fraction of a second they met hers. There was no recognition in them. To him, She was just another face in the crowd. The moment passed, and he turned back to his conversation. The realization was both a relief and a strange, sharp disappointment. She was his investment, but he didn't even know what she looked like. She was just a name on a deed, a file in his assistant's briefcase. The thought strengthened her resolve. She would not be defined by his charity. She would build her own life on her own terms. She would make him proud of his investment, whether he ever knew it or not. The moment Arthur Sterling's indifferent gaze swept past her, something inside Eleanor solidified. The fluttering anxiety, the sense of being an imposter didn't vanish, but it was overshadowed by a new, steely resolve. He didn't know her. Fine. In a way, that was a gift. It meant her success or her failure was her own. She was not a character in his story. She was the author of hers. With newfound determination, she turned her attention to the silent auction. The tables were laden with extravagant offerings, week-long stays in Aspen, signed sports memorabilia, diamond tennis bracelets. The opening bids alone were more than her monthly salary used to be. She felt a familiar pang of otherness, but this time, she refused to let it shrink her. She moved along the tables, observing, when a particular item caught her eye. It was nestled between a case of vintage wine and a spa package, a simple, framed piece of art. It was a child's drawing, rendered in bright, bold crayon strokes. It depicted a superhero, a figure in red and blue, standing protectively in front of a school building. Underneath, a child's scrawl read, "Our School Guardian." The artist's name was listed as Noah S. Kindergarten. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Noah S. It had to be him, the little boy from the toy store, the son of the man across the room. She stared at the drawing, her heart aching with a strange mix of emotions. Here was the source of her miracle, a 5-year-old's simple, profound empathy captured in crayon. The minimum bid was $100. Without a second thought, she picked up the pen and wrote her name, Eleanor Vance, on the bid sheet, next to the number 150. It was an impulsive act, a quiet message sent out into the universe. A small, anonymous thank you. As she was writing, a syrupy voice cut through her concentration. "Well, look at you, Eleanor. Getting into the spirit of things." It was Brenda, a flute of champagne in her hand, her smile as bright and hard as a diamond. Her eyes flickered from Eleanor's simple dress to the bid sheet. Noah Sterling's little drawing. How sweet. His father donates a new gymnasium every other year, but I suppose every little bit helps. The condescension was so thick, Eleanor could have choked on it. The old Eleanor would have mumbled an apology and fled. But the new Eleanor, the one who had survived eviction and despair, the one who was now a homeowner and a student, held her ground. "I think it's a beautiful piece," she said, her voice even and calm. "It shows a lot of heart." Brenda let out a short, tinkling laugh. "It's a crayon drawing, dear, not a Picasso." She leaned in conspiratorially, her perfume overpowering. "Just a little friendly advice. You might want to save your money. The live auction is where the real action is. Arthur Sterling always bids on his son's art project. He ends up paying thousands for it. It's become a bit of a tradition." The words were meant to intimidate, to put Eleanor back in her place. But they had the opposite effect. A quiet, fierce anger began to burn in Eleanor's chest. This beautiful, heartfelt drawing was being used as a tool in a rich man's game, a piece of theater for the wealthy elite to applaud. It cheapened the pure, simple act that had changed her life. It cheapened Noah's empathy. She gave Brenda a cool smile. "Thanks for the tip," she said, and walked away, her mind racing. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Eleanor made polite, non-committal conversation, but her focus was elsewhere. She kept glancing at the bid sheet for Noah's drawing. Soon another name appeared below hers, bidding $200. Then another, for $250. She knew it was Brenda and her friends, driving up the price, playing their game. Later, the live auction began. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a slick smile, moved through the big-ticket items with practiced ease. Finally, he arrived at the class art projects. "And now," he boomed, "a very special piece from our kindergarten class, a future masterpiece entitled Our School Guardian by the talented Noah Sterling." A polite ripple of laughter and applause went through the crowd. Arthur Sterling, seated at a front table, offered a small, tired smile. "We'll start the bidding at $500, the auctioneer said. A hand in the back shot up. 1,000, someone called. Eleanor recognized the voice. It was Brenda's husband. 2,000, came a voice from another table. Arthur Sterling watched, a passive observer at his own tradition. This was what was expected of him. Eleanor's heart pounded. She watched as the price climbed. 3,000, 4,000, 5,000. It was obscene. It was a performance. And Noah's sweet drawing was just the prop. When the bidding stalled at $6,000, the auctioneer turned his attention to the front table. Mr. Sterling? Shall we say 10? Arthur gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. We have $10,000, the auctioneer announced to a fresh round of applause. Going once, going twice. This was it. The game was over. The tradition upheld. Arthur Sterling would buy his son's drawing for an absurd amount of money. Everyone would clap and nothing would really mean anything. But in that moment, Eleanor thought of Leo, safe in their warm house. She thought of the little boy with the solemn face in the toy store. She thought of the $37 that had once been her entire world, and a reckless, defiant impulse took over. 11,000. The voice was clear, steady, and loud enough to carry through the suddenly quiet ballroom. It took Eleanor a moment to realize it was her own. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Every head turned to look at her, the quiet woman in the simple black dress standing in the back. Brenda's jaw had literally dropped. The auctioneer's eyes widened in surprise. We have $11,000 from the lovely lady in the back, he announced, a new excitement in his voice. All eyes, including Arthur Sterling's, were now fixed on her. This time there was no indifference in his gaze. There was shock, confusion, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine curiosity. He looked at her, really looked at her, and it was as if a dormant file had just been activated in his brain. He didn't know her name, but he knew her face. He remembered the fierce, protective desperation in aisle 7. He remembered the mother. A slow, subtle smile played on his lips. The game had just changed. He raised his hand. 15,000, he said, his voice calm and resonant. The crowd murmured. This was new. This was unexpected. The auctioneer's grin widened. 15,000 from Mr. Sterling. Do I hear 16? Eleanor's mind was racing. This was madness. What was she doing? This was money she didn't have, a battle she couldn't possibly win. But she couldn't back down. Not now. This was no longer about a drawing. It was about something else, something she couldn't even articulate. It was about showing him, and showing everyone in this room, that she was not a charity case, that she had agency, that she understood the true value of his son's gift. 16,000, she called out, her voice not wavering. Arthur Sterling's smile grew. He looked amused, intrigued. He was enjoying this. He raised his hand again, without hesitation. 20,000. The room was buzzing now. This was the most exciting thing that had happened at a school fundraiser in years. Who was this woman? Where had she come from? Eleanor felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, dissecting her, judging her. She could feel Brenda's venomous glare from across the room. She knew she should stop. This was a fool's errand, but the image of Noah's drawing, of that small, brave superhero, flashed in her mind. 21,000, she said, her voice a little quieter this time, but still firm. The auctioneer looked at Arthur, his eyebrows raised. The entire room held its breath. Arthur Sterling looked at Eleanor, a long, appraising look. He saw not the desperate woman from the toy store, but a woman with a spine of steel, a fire in her eyes, and a quiet dignity that filled the cavernous room. He saw the kind of character he had told David he wanted to invest in. He had bought her a house to give her a foundation, and now here she was trying to build something on it, right in front of him. And he realized the tradition wasn't about him publicly overpaying for his son's art. The real tradition, the one Catherine would have loved, was what was happening right now. An unexpected act of defiance, of heart, of someone valuing something for the right reasons. He gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head to the auctioneer. $21,000, the auctioneer bellowed, slamming his gavel down with a resounding crack. Sold. To the lady in black. The room erupted in a confused mixture of applause and stunned whispers. Eleanor felt her knees go weak. What had she just done? She had just pledged an amount of money that would gut her savings, the safety net that had allowed her to sleep at night. Panic began to set in, cold and sharp. As people began to move, to talk, to buzz about the shocking turn of events, she saw Arthur Sterling rise from his table. He began walking towards her, his expression unreadable. He moved through the crowd with an effortless grace, people parting for him as he approached. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. He was going to confront her. He was going to ask her what she thought she was doing, publicly embarrassing him, hijacking his tradition. He stopped in front of her. He was taller than she had imagined, and his presence was even more formidable up close. She had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "That was quite a performance," he said, his voice a low, neutral baritone. I'm sorry if I overstepped," she stammered, her face flushing. I loved the drawing. It reminded me of my own son." Arthur's expression softened. "There's nothing to be sorry for. You paid what it was worth." He paused, a flicker of something she couldn't decipher in his eyes. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I'm Arthur Sterling." "Eleanor Vance," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Vance," he said, and there was a genuine warmth in his voice that she had not expected. He extended his hand. As her hand met his, a strange jolt, like a low-voltage electrical current, passed between them. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated connection, a bridge forming across the vast chasm of their different worlds. "The pleasure is all mine, Mr. Sterling," she said, and for the first time she truly meant it. "Believe me," in that moment, surrounded by the whispers and stares of the city's elite, they were the only two people in the room, a billionaire who had lost his heart and a single mother who had just found her footing, brought together by a child's crayon drawing of a hero.